The ocean doesn't care how experienced you are. Commercial fishing is consistently ranked among the most dangerous jobs in the world. And the men and women who do it know that every single time they leave the dock, there's a chance they simply won't come back. Tonight, 3 true stories that prove exactly how far that danger can go. A swordfishing crew that vanished into a storm so violent it became a best-selling book and a Hollywood film. A crab boat that capsized in the Bering Sea in a matter of minutes, leaving only 2 men alive to tell what happened. And a lone fisherman who drifted across the entire Pacific Ocean for over a year, surviving on nothing but raw fish, turtle blood, and sheer will. Every detail in this video is documented. Coast Guard investigations, federal safety reports, and first-hand survivor accounts. Let's get into it. Story 1. The Perfect Storm. Gloucester, Massachusetts has been a fishing town since the 1600s, and the base of a bronze memorial in its harbor bears the names of more than 3,000 local men lost at sea over the centuries. In September of 1991, a 72-foot sword-fishing boat called the Andrea Gail left that same harbor with a 6-man crew headed for the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, roughly 900 miles away. The trip had already been a rough one. Weeks into the voyage, the crew's catch had been poor. And to make matters worse, the boat's ice machine was failing, which meant anything they did manage to bring in would spoil before they could get it home. Captain Billy Tyne made the call to push further out toward a fishing ground called the Flemish Cap, hoping for one last good haul before turning back. It worked. Their luck improved dramatically, but it also meant a longer trip home at the worst possible moment. On October 27th, with a solid catch finally in the hold, Tyne turned the Andrea Gail back toward Gloucester. What none of them fully grasped yet was that 3 separate weather systems were converging directly along their route home. A cold front moving through New England, a high-pressure system building over the Great Lakes, and, most dangerously, the remnants of Hurricane Grace churning up from the south. A National Weather Service forecaster in Boston would later describe the specific, rare combination as close to meteorologically perfect, in the worst possible sense. A phrase that would go on to give the storm its name. On the evening of October 28th, Tyne made contact with another vessel and reported his position. Roughly 130 miles north-northeast of Sable Island, already fighting 80-knot winds. Later that same evening, he radioed one final time, reaching Linda Greenlaw, captain of a sister ship called the Hannah Boden, and gave her his coordinates along with a grim weather report. His final recorded words to her were simple and direct. "She's coming on, boys, and she's coming on strong." That was the last anyone ever heard from the Andrea Gail. The storm that followed became one of the most violent ever recorded in the North Atlantic. Weather buoys near the boat's last known position recorded wave heights exceeding 60 feet, and one buoy off the coast of Nova Scotia measured a wave over 100 feet tall, the highest ever recorded in that province's offshore waters. Wind gusts in the area reached upward of 92 to 120 miles per hour. Somewhere in the middle of that chaos, a small, aging 72-foot fishing boat with a crew of 6 was simply overwhelmed. No distress call was ever received. No mayday, no final radio transmission, nothing. The Coast Guard launched a massive search, eventually covering 186,000 square miles of open ocean over 10 days. They found almost nothing. A fuel drum, an empty life raft, and on November 6th, the boat's emergency position indicating beacon washed up on the shore of Sable Island, a stretch of coastline so notorious for shipwrecks, it's nicknamed the Graveyard of the Atlantic. The beacon was designed to trigger automatically on contact with seawater, but investigators could never conclusively determine whether it had actually been switched on or whether it had simply activated on its own after the boat went down. On November 9th, with no further trace of the vessel or its crew, the search was called off due to what officials described only as the low probability of survival. All 6 men aboard, Captain Billy Tyne, Bobby Shatford, David Sullivan, Dale Murphy, Michael Moran, and Alfred Pierre, were lost. No bodies were ever recovered. The wreck itself has never been found. To this day, exactly what happened in the boat's final moments remains speculation. Some researchers believe a rogue wave rolled the vessel. Others point to possible engine failure caused by fuel tank sediment stirred up in the chaos. The boat's own design, described later as having drainage issues on one side of the deck, may have compounded whatever went wrong. Nobody will ever know for certain because nobody survived to explain it. The story became the basis for Sebastian Junger's 1997 book, The Perfect Storm, and the blockbuster film that followed 3 years later. But in Gloucester itself, the Andrea Gail isn't a movie. It's 6 names engraved on the base of a memorial that already carried thousands of others. A permanent, physical reminder of exactly what the town's fishing fleet has always risked every time it leaves the harbor. Story 2. 10 minutes in the Bering Sea. The Bering Sea crab fishery is widely considered one of the most dangerous workplaces on Earth. In the 1990s alone, 73 crew members died fishing those waters. A toll so severe, it earned the fishery a grim reputation that television would later turn into an entire genre of reality programming. On New Year's Eve of 2019, that danger caught up with a 130-foot crab boat called the Scandies Rose. The vessel, built in 1978 and considered by those who knew it to be an exceptionally sturdy, well-built boat. Some crew members affectionately called it the Tank, left Kodiak, Alaska on December 30th, loaded with 198 crab pots and bound for fishing grounds in the Bering Sea. 7 men were aboard, including Captain Gary Cobbin Jr. and his adult son David. The National Weather Service had already issued gale warnings and a heavy freezing spray advisory for the exact route the boat was taking, and both survivors later said the entire crew knew going in that the weather ahead was going to be, in their words, lousy. Throughout the day and into the evening, freezing sea spray began accumulating as ice on the boat's crab pots and railings. A well-known and extremely dangerous hazard in Alaskan winter fishing, since ice buildup on the upper deck can make a boat progressively more unstable, top-heavy, and prone to capsizing. By early evening, ice had built up so heavily on the starboard side of the vessel that the boat was already listing 20 degrees. In an attempt to find calmer water, the captain changed course toward a nearby island. But the shift in direction only made the list worse rather than better. At around 10 p.m., everything unraveled with terrifying speed. Survivor John Lawler later testified that he felt something was seriously wrong and ran to find the captain, who told him bluntly that he believed they were sinking. There was no time for anything resembling an orderly response. Lawler had to scramble to find a survival suit from an emergency locker as the boat listed further and further, fight in a jammed zipper with the help of fellow crew member Dean Gribble, as the deck beneath them tilted more with every passing second. By the time the two men made it outside, they found themselves no longer standing on the deck, but on the side of the boat itself, which had rolled that far over. One survivor later put it as simply as possible: from being asleep to swimming in the freezing Gulf of Alaska took about 10 minutes. A wave swept both men off the hull and into the water. In the chaos, they became separated from each other and from the rest of the crew. Lawler and Gribble each managed independently to reach an inflatable life raft that had automatically deployed as the Scandies Rose went down, and by shouting to each other in the darkness, found their way to the same raft and pulled each other aboard. From there, they could only watch as the boat disappeared beneath the surface, with no sign of any of their 5 other crewmates making it off in time. What followed was nearly 4 hours adrift in 20-foot seas, in a life raft with no working locator beacon, its small emergency light eventually failing entirely, leaving the two men with nothing but a handheld flashlight to signal for help in the pitch-black freezing night. Rescue crews, launched the moment the Mayday call came through, faced a brutal 170-mile flight through the same storm system in a Coast Guard helicopter, in what the flight commander later called the most challenging mission of his career. Just before dawn, a rescue swimmer finally located the two men and pulled them from the raft. The Coast Guard searched more than 1,400 square miles of open ocean for the other 5 crew members: Captain Gary Cobbin Jr., his son David, and crewmates Seth Russo-Gano, Arthur Ganachias, and Brock Rainey. Using multiple helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and a full Coast Guard cutter for roughly 20 hours straight, none of them were ever found. Federal investigators later determined that the crew had followed the ship's official stability instructions exactly as written. The problem was that those instructions themselves were inaccurate, giving the captain a dangerously incomplete picture of how much ice the vessel could safely carry before losing its stability entirely. Combined with ice accumulation more extreme than had been forecast, the investigation concluded the Scandies Rose lost the margin of stability it needed to survive the storm through no failure of the crew's own skill or judgment. The disaster led to a formal $9 million settlement for the survivors and victims' families, and prompted new federal safety recommendations aimed at improving how crab boats calculate and communicate their ice-related stability limits. A lesson that arrived, as it so often does in this fishery, only after 5 more names had already been added to a list that was already far too long. Story 3: 438 Days Adrift. On November 17th, 2012, a 33-year-old Salvadoran shark fisherman named José Salvador Alvarenga set out from the small fishing village of Costa Azul on Mexico's Pacific coast for what was supposed to be a routine 1 or 2 day deep-sea fishing trip. His usual fishing partner couldn't make the trip, so Alvarenga brought along a replacement he barely knew. a 22-year-old day laborer named Ezequiel Cordoba, with almost no fishing experience at all. A few hours into the trip, a violent storm hit, and it didn't let up for 5 straight days. The two men lost their engine, their radio, most of their electronics, and much of their fishing gear. In a desperate attempt to keep the small fiberglass boat maneuverable in the rough seas, they were forced to dump nearly 1,100 pounds of fish they'd already caught back into the ocean. Alvarenga managed to get a single garbled distress call out over the two-way radio before its battery died completely. A search effort was launched by his employer, but with visibility near zero throughout the storm, it was called off after just 2 days, having found nothing. With no engine, no sail, no oars, and no way to signal for help, the boat began to drift, and it never stopped. What started as a 2-day trip stretched into a nightmare that would ultimately last 438 days. Alvarenga, who had been fishing since childhood, kept both men alive using skills most people would never think to rely on. He caught fish with his bare hands, learned to snatch seabirds that landed on the boat, looking for a place to rest, breaking their wings so they couldn't fly away, and effectively keeping a live food supply of 20 or 30 birds on board at any given time. He killed sea turtles when they were close enough to shore to find them, and the two men drank the turtles' blood directly for hydration and nutrients. Later, further out in open ocean, they ate shark liver, prized for its concentrated nutritional value, along with whatever fish Alvarenga could catch by hand. For shelter from the relentless equatorial sun, the two men spent entire days folded inside an overturned styrofoam ice box meant for storing fish. A space so cramped that doctors would later find both men had suffered slipped vertebrae simply from the positions they were forced to hold day after day for over a year. Rainwater became the difference between life and death. During a stretch with no rain at all, both men came dangerously close to dying of thirst. Alvarenga later said his tongue swelled so badly he couldn't even speak. They survived only once they began collecting floating plastic bottles and an empty oil drum that drifted past the boat, eventually assembling a small collection of containers that let them capture and store rainwater whenever a storm finally passed through. Roughly 10 weeks into the ordeal, Cordoba, weakened, refused to eat raw birds and fish the way Alvarenga had learned to tolerate, and his health deteriorated rapidly. He died aboard the small boat, leaving Alvarenga completely alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no way of knowing how much longer his own ordeal might last. In the disorienting months that followed, Alvarenga has said he began hallucinating conversations with his dead companion, at one point speaking to the body for days before eventually deciding, in a moment of clarity, to bury Cordoba at sea. Alvarenga later described spotting several large cargo ships passing in the distance during his time adrift, and said he tried everything he could think of to signal them. Waving, shouting, even lighting a shirt on fire tied to a stick. None of it worked. In one particularly devastating moment, he watched the crew of a passing container ship actually wave back at him and then simply continue on their way without stopping. He tracked the passage of time by counting lunar cycles. After his 15th full moon adrift, he finally spotted land, a small remote islet that turned out to be part of the Marshall Islands, nearly 7,000 miles from where he'd first set out. On January 30th, 2014, he swam the final stretch to shore, found a small beach house belonging to a local couple, and collapsed. He would later say he didn't care anymore whether he lived or died at that exact moment, only that he was, finally, on solid ground. Alvarenga's story initially drew enormous skepticism from journalists and the public, given how implausible it sounded on its face. But oceanographers at the University of Hawaii later confirmed that known Pacific drift patterns and weather models lined up precisely with the roughly 6,000-mile journey he described. And investigators confirmed the registration number on his recovered boat matched the one reported missing over a year earlier. He remains to this day the only person in recorded history confirmed to have survived adrift at sea in a small open boat for more than a year. 3 stories, 3 very different kinds of danger. A storm so violent it swallowed an entire 6-man crew without a single distress call. A crab boat that went from routine transit to total capsize in under 10 minutes. And a lone man who outlasted 14 months of open ocean, using nothing but his own bare hands and an unbreakable will to survive. What ties all 3 of these stories together is the same simple, unforgiving truth about the sea. It doesn't matter how many years of experience a captain has, how sturdy a boat is built, or how careful a crew tries to be. The ocean operates entirely on its own terms, and it offers no guarantees to anyone who goes out onto it. For every fisherman who makes it home safely after a long, uneventful trip, there's another whose ordinary voyage turned into exactly the kind of story you just heard. If this video got under your skin, hit subscribe. New true stories every week. And let me know in the comments which one of these 3 stories disturbed you the most. See you in the next one.